Jay Bennett is the chairman of the National Christian Foundation, the world's largest faith-based provider of donor-advised funds. Prior to his work with the NCF, he practiced corporate law for 35 years. Joining Jay will be Ward Brehm, who many of you are familiar with, and if you're not, you're in for a real treat. Ward has served as the chairman of the United States African Development Foundation and was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal, which is the highest civilian honor. He is also the author of one of my personal favorite books of all times, Bigger Than Me, which you can pick up afterwards. And even before they start, I'm going to mention that Jay has generously offered his book, I'll bring it up after, for each of you to take home after the talk. So please help me welcome my friends, Jay and Ward.
Thanks. Good afternoon. I love the fact that Opportunity International takes chances. One of the biggest chances I've ever had is having both of us up here unchaperoned. It's a little different format for me, and I talked to Jay last night, and I told him that, frankly, I was a little nervous, and he didn't pause a second. He said, Ward, if God's going to speak through us tomorrow, neither of us has to be nervous. It's God that should be nervous.
And isn't that the truth? Ward and I like Oreo cookies. We're going to follow that model today. He's going to open up with a little chocolate wafer. We're going to combine for a little filling, and then he's going to put a little chocolate wafer on the back end, all right? That's the image that we'll follow. And we're here in part to talk about optimism and hope, but in particular, generosity. There's so much to be optimistic about. It's been great to listen to the input throughout the day, and my goodness, what a fabulous organization. There's so much to be optimistic about and so much to be hopeful about. Ward's had a recent experience that brought a new dimension of hope into his life, and we're just going to start with the Oreo cookie by talking a little bit about Sister Irene.
Yeah, I had a absolutely amazing experience. In fact, I'm in the middle of it. Hope isn't wishful thinking. When we talk about hope here, it's actually defined in the Greek as confident expectation. And I think all true hope is hope that we have not in ourselves, but in God. It was a few months ago, I got a phone call from a friend, and I picked up the phone, and he said, would you be willing to have breakfast with me and 3 nuns? He said, are you there? I go, yeah, I'm waiting for the punchline. He goes, I'm serious. I don't tell jokes. I'm serious. I said, well, how can I refuse an offer like that? So I went and I had lunch with Sister Irene and 2 other nuns from Africa. And I was absolutely blown away by what she told me. She said there are 600,000 nuns embedded in poor communities all throughout the world. Nobody's heard of them. Nobody recognizes them. They don't communicate with one another. They're not funded, but they are there for life. And this is an army that has largely been untapped. Never heard of it. Never heard of such a thing. So as she explained this vision and her hope for some government funding, I said, it's such a huge vision, this connecting all over the world. You got to start someplace. You got to prove this concept, right? You got to start small. So why don't you talk to your sisters and get back with something that we can at least get our hands around. Took her about a week, and she came back, and she said, yeah, we decided to start with child trafficking in El Salvador. I said, why don't you try something hard? We sent a team down to El Salvador, and they gathered 30 of these nuns and put them in a little circle. And they decided to go around the room and have each one share what it is that they do. So Sister Margaret starts, and so Sister Margaret, tell us, what do you do? Well, I don't really do anything. Oh. Margaret, next one, what do you do? I don't really do anything either. Went around, all 30 of them said the same thing, a variation on the same thing, that they really don't do anything. So now we got a network of 600,000 nuns, none of them do anything. But in a moment of inspiration, he said, well, Sister Margaret, what did you do yesterday? Oh, yesterday. I was so busy yesterday. I run an orphanage for 90 kids, and we only have food through Wednesday. And I had to knock on every hotel door. I would just knock myself out. Yesterday was really, really a busy day. Turns to the next one. So, Agnes, what did you do yesterday? Oh, yesterday. I met with the 3 major gang leaders in El Salvador. Just right at the intersection, not too far from the most dangerous intersection on the face of the earth. What did you say to the gang leaders? She said, well, we sat down and I explained to them that I have a school for kids and that the kids come from their respective neighborhoods, and that I had heard that over the last couple of months, some of my kids were being harassed by your gang members as they come through your neighborhood. And so I'm just here to tell you that if you, reaches into her purse and pulls this up, and she says, if you happen to see a child wearing this t-shirt, if you so much as look at that child the wrong way, I'm going to ask Jesus to put a millstone around your neck and you'll spend eternity in hell. You can't make this up. And so, well, how did it work? Oh, it worked unbelievably. This morning, the gang leader comes in on his motorcycle. He's got 3 of my kids on the back, and he's going, Sister Agnes, got some of your kids. Gang leaders are holding her hand. Here they are. We got them here. The hope that I find in that, we often talk about servant leadership, and I don't like the term because everybody wants to be a leader, nobody wants to be a servant. But these ladies they're going about their job. Whether we are able to connect them with funding with the government, it waits to be seen. But it's just a huge encouragement to see them again, embedded in these communities, and my philosophy has always been, look where God's already working and join him there. And that's just a great example. We're going to turn the page and talk a little bit about generosity. I don't know anybody on this planet that knows more about generosity than Jay as chairman of the National Christian Foundation, but in addition to that, more importantly, he exhibits it in his own life. So Jay, talk to us a little bit about your journey from success to significance.
Sister Irene is such a fabulous example because she possesses nothing, but she possesses everything. She's completely subordinated her life, as Pastor John said before lunch, to the power that's available to transform a community. It's really a marvelous story. In addition to the National Christian Foundation, I'm privileged to serve in an organization started by a guy named Bob Buford called the Halftime Institute. And my dear friend Jane Nelson and I served on that board for a number of years. There's Peter by her side. But the Halftime Institute talks about this graphic, the sigmoid curve. It talks about moving from success to significance. And we use this curve to show how, in our culture in particular, we move up this slope of success. But then we go through a season and we wonder, well, is this all there really is? And so we talk about significance, and we help people at the Halftime Institute move into this season of greater significance. And Bob Buford, the founder, said he actually went through 16 different sigmoid curves. But we just look at this little simple one, and let me just offer it in the context of generosity. We come into the world. Our life around generosity is certainly shaped in our upbringing. We get out of school, we go to work, we work our tails off pretty hard. We pursue success as American culture defines it, and then we run up to a sigmoid curve, and it braces this question about significance. Well, what more is there? So that's a halftime focus, and I'd just like to stop there for a moment in the context of generosity. We've talked about this. We've known each other for 50 years. We've talked about this for a while. How do you react to this process, these sigmoid curves?
I give myself an A. Shape, struggle, success, significance. Yeah, I don't know. Anybody else? I give myself a pretty high grade. Anybody else? Come on, you guys. We're all success, significance. This is elementary, right?
Let me just share another factor. Along the journey, there can be another sigmoid curve. Bob Buford went through 16 of them. And this next sigmoid curve beyond success, as we define it in our own elephant dance of being significant, is this issue of submission, of surrender. Like Sister Irene, how do we go through this sigmoid curve where we surrender who we are and use our giftedness for the Lord's purposes in ways that He can really empower what we do to offer transformative change, like Sister Irene, but with resources and capabilities that can change the world. What's your reaction to that?
Well, my grade went to a D+. No, I was actually making improvement on this particular area. Chris, my beautiful wife over here, once mentioned not too long ago, she goes, it seems like you're actually, of late, kind of becoming partners with Jesus. I kind of smiled at the compliment, and then she added, the only problem is you're the managing partner.
It's a worthy thing to remember. I want to submit to you today, we do, because we've talked about this, that there are a couple barriers to surrender. I describe the first as mammon, and the second is the true riches. Jesus tells us that if we're not trustworthy with earthly riches, why would I entrust you with the true riches? What are the true riches? What's that mean? So I submit for you to think about that the issues of mammon and really not understanding the true riches are barriers to surrender and the full upside that God intends for our lives in terms of serving. Now, here we go. Mammon is referred to by Jesus in the book of Matthew, the 6th chapter. He's talking about the fact that, boy, you really shouldn't just ring it up in your own ledger. There's a lot to do. You should lay up treasure in heaven. And he gets to the point where he says, you just can't serve God and mammon. A lot of people think mammon is money. I've come to understand that mammon certainly is money, but it's also at least an emotional or a psychological force, if not a spiritual force in our lives. I thought I might have both arms. Mammon is an inhibiting force. Mammon is a laminate on our lives that prevents us from being generous. Gee, 2008 was a tough year. Yeah, we've been in a bull market for a long time, but this week was hard. The market was down 800 points. Yeah, maybe it's rebounded a little bit. The Fed is upping interest rates. I don't know if I can really be more generous than I am. I give 2.5% to my church. I write occasional other checks. I'm not so sure I can really be generous around that one. Yeah, I know I was on the board, but I'm not so sure about that guy or this guy. Or I didn't really like the message last week. Those are mammon-related issues. And the question is, as a barrier to moving from our own sense of significance, our own elephant dance, into a zone of surrender and service that's more powerful than ever we can imagine, how can we recognize and demote mammon in our lives so they get rid of it? It's going to be around. We're going to see him coming from time to time. But how do we recognize mammon and demote him in a way that allows us to be more free and move into that zone of surrender? What do you think about that?
It brings up a question that I'll ask, and the question is, are you rich? I've asked that question of myself, and the answer was no. Chris and I don't have to worry about money anymore, but we lead a lifestyle that we feel is fairly moderate. So we're not rich, we're just comfortable. Rich people are people with more money than me. I tried this experiment with astonishing results. People with net worths of $1 million, $10 million, $100 million, $1 billion, all consider themselves to be affluent, but nobody considers themselves to be rich. Rich people are people with more money than we have. More houses, bigger boats. They're the ones who are rich. And about a year ago, I discovered that my own definition of being greedy fell into the same category. I'm not greedy. The greedy people are the people with more money than me. They're the ones that should be giving more money, not me. They're the ones that are greedy, not me. Oh, really? So I needed some context here, and I needed to try to figure out what wealth means in comparison with the rest of the world. You can look at the slide, but these are some astonishing statistics for me. If you own a car, any car, you're in the top 20% of the world's wealthiest people. If you earned $1,500 last year, you're in the top 20% of income earners in the world. If you have just $60,000 in assets, or earn $25,000 or more a year, which is just above the poverty line in America, you're in the top 10% of the world's richest people. If you earn more than $50,000 a year and or have more than $500,000 in assets, you're part of the richest 1% on the planet. So I don't know about the rest of you, but for me, it makes me realize that not only am I rich, I'm stinking rich. Is anybody else in this room getting a headache right now?
So we come up the sigmoid curve. We make it through significance, which is it's a wonderful thing to be significant and to be a generous person. But we get up to this part of the sigmoid curve, the surrender curve, which Jesus also calls the eye of the needle. And so here we come. Here I am coming up the slope, accumulating earthly riches. I come to recognize that mammon in some ways can be a positive thing, helps me accumulate more. I pull up to the eye of the needle in my semi-trailer truck with a dollar sign on it, loaded with my investment portfolios and my real estate and different things. I'm riding shotgun. Mammon's at the wheel. Jesus comes walking up to me on that side of the oval and he says, hey, Bennett, we've actually known each other for quite a long time. You've got some reputation for being generous, but my goodness. He said, I recognize your driver. And I recognize what's in the back of your semi-trailer tractor that you've accumulated over all these years. And now here we are at the eye of the needle. And it's easier for a camel to get through this thing than it's going to be for you to get through it. But I've got some ideas, and I'd actually like to journey with you. I'd like to actually show you that there's a much greater benefit on the other side of this oval. So why don't you get rid of your driver? Why don't you back the truck up, unload it, lay up that treasure in heaven, because where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And then come on back in a smaller truck, and you and I will journey across the sigmoid curve together. We'll take a journey across this eye of the needle, because what I'm really looking for in my life with you is intimacy. Generosity is a portal to intimacy with the Lord. And then you're not going to get there on your own, but I can walk with you, and I can use your giftedness, and I can introduce you into a realm of kingdom living that's got intimacy and serendipity and moment-to-moment thanksgiving for how you're being used. And you're going to understand Sister Irene a lot better than you do today. So there is a journey across this sigmoid, and you've been through it. You're in the middle of it. Give us a few comments about your own journey.
I guess like a lot of people, I always used to equate generosity with, for lack of a better word, scarcity. It was not very fun. I mean, and the whole dynamic was messed up, right? People would come with hat in hand and ask me to give them money, and it seemed the whole dynamic was a mess. And I used to actually wince in the old days writing checks, until I realized that if being generous is attached to duty or obligation, it takes all the fun out of it. It takes all of the joy and the excitement and once I came to that realization, and many of us have, everybody's heard of this donor fatigue, right? Everybody's tired of all these relentless asks and asks and asks. It's actually turned now into something much more serious. It's turned into compassion fatigue, where people are just turning the page on these tremendous human needs and disasters. And I think one of the reasons is that they're missing the boat. They're missing the joy. They're missing the excitement. The idea, if somebody would have told me when I was 40 years old what I would be doing now, the places that I go, the money that I would be giving away, the things that I would be part of, actively involved with, I would have told them, you know, they were smoking something. And for me, this idea of being unleashed, untethered from the constraints of obligation, and moving into this idea into this flow of generosity has become, for me, without any question, the joy and the ride of my life, the most exciting, most hang on for dear life. Once you get that small truck, it's going to drive like a Ferrari.
So Ward and I talk about these things in terms of how do we recognize and demote mammon in our lives, and how do we come to put greater value on the true riches. It's almost like a set of barbells where through our accumulation and our own success and perhaps sense of significance, we've got one end of the barbell that's loaded up with all kinds of plates, but the other end of the barbell doesn't have as many plates on it. So when we go to lift the barbell, things naturally go this direction. They go toward what we've accumulated. But as we journey into generosity and add plates to the other end of the bar, the weight shifts in a way and the rewards shift in a way where the value is on the other side of the bar. It's in the true riches. It's in what life is really about and the fulfillment that comes with it. So we've talked about, and we'd suggest there are two aspects of this journey across this surrender curve that we just left up for your consideration. One of them is renewal of the mind. You know, the Apostle Paul tells us that we're not to be conformed by this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And there's a huge difference between one side of the oval and the other, one of which is when we build these businesses, when we grow them up, when we work our tails off, when our identity is associated with them, we think we're the owner. Of course we're the owner. We sacrificed in order to build these things. The Lord tells us that God's the owner. He gives us the ability to create wealth for his covenant purposes. Deuteronomy 8:18. We think we earned it because we worked our tails for us. That's a strong psychological, emotional reality. What about the reality that God enabled us to do it? What about that mental mindset? Or what about the fact that in truth, if we really admit it, much of our security is what we hold, what we've got invested, and what it's worth, when our security can be in him. Jesus tells us that. Do we really get there? It's part of the journey through the sigmoid curve of surrender. Do I hoard it here? Do I just stockpile it here, even though I may be a generous person? Or does the word of Jesus to lay it up in heaven, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also? Are we able to renew our mind in that direction? In the book, The Treasure Principle, the author tells a story about the Civil War and how people in the Confederacy near the end of the war, if they were smart and they had a bunch of Confederate currency, they realized the war is coming to an end and their Confederate currency isn't going to be worth a whole lot, so they started flipping their Confederate currency for Union currency. They laid up their treasure in a different place. We all have opportunity, generous people though we are, to think about how do we creatively lay up our treasure in heaven for fabulous organizations like Opportunity International. So one aspect of it is the renewal of the mind. How do we go from point A to point B across this sigmoid curve? And then the other point is what I would call a generosity journey. And I think we're all on a generosity journey. But the idea of becoming more and more generous, and wherever you may be now, which is great, wherever you may be, there's opportunity to take next steps. But it's kind of like a switch on a wall where you first of all have to flip the switch. You have to engage the power. But then as you take hold of the rheostat and begin to turn the dial, the light of the world comes into your life. The Lord nurtures your generosity in a way that introduces you into a zone of meaning and fulfillment that is transformative. So there is this generosity journey for each of us, and each of us is somewhere on the journey. Many, many years ago, when Sally and I went back to church for the first time because we thought our 3-year-old should go to church, you know, we threw a few bucks, we threw a little currency in the offering because, you know, we didn't want the church to have our contact information. You know? We knew we'd be in the nursery if we did. So we grew a little bit. We started writing checks, and where were we the next week? We were in the nursery, you know, with our little guy and a bunch of other kids. But we've been on a journey for a long time, and I've been a slow learner. Believe me, if there's any hope I have today, it's that something we say may accelerate your own journey. But you move toward tithing, and the famous question, do you tithe on the net or do you tithe on the gross, okay? But then you move into tithing and offerings. Wow, a combination of tithes and offerings. But then the question of, do we tithe just on our income, or do we begin to think, wow, I could tithe off my balance sheet. I could look at my investments, and I could look at how they did in addition to my cash flow tithing. And the question of, you know, how much do I keep? Not how much do I give, but how much do I keep? Because as we're on that journey, moving towards demoting mammon, experiencing the true riches, the Lord draws us into greater and greater intimacy with Him and a personal freedom that occupies our bodies, our minds, our thoughts in ways that make life on earth a lot more interesting and create a shorter step into the kingdom at the end of our days. So there is that journey that's available to us. Ward and I talked the other day about the parables of the precious pearl. The kingdom of heaven is like a field with a treasure in it that a man discovers, and to his great joy goes back and sells his goods to buy the field. Or it's like a precious pearl, a merchant in pearls who discovers this great pearl and sells what he has in order to buy this pearl and enjoy the priceless value that's available through the true riches. So we commend to you the idea of optimism and hope, but also a generosity journey wherever you may be in your life. There are great adventures ahead.
So the next question we both had is, how do we land this thing? How do we bring this in for a landing? And I'm going to tell you a story. I was in Eastern Congo working with a really good friend of mine on a project we're doing. And he was a Hindu. And as time went on, he started asking me some questions about Jesus. He said, you know, the way you talk about him, it's almost like you know him. And as we talked, about a week later, he at a meeting, he said, I need to change the subject. Your Jesus, your scripture says that the number one commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Oh, good, you're paying attention. He said, how do you do that? My mind went completely blank. He said, is this a tough question? Jesus himself said the most important commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and you look stumped. And I said, actually, I am. So I'll ask you the question. How do you love God with all your heart, soul, and mind? Harder than you think. I had to go back. I looked it up in Matthew, and I saw something that I'd never seen before. Right after Jesus said that, he said, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Little wheel clicked into place. It was the first time that it was absolutely obvious to me. It's right there that the only way that we can love God with all our heart, soul, and mind is to love our neighbors as ourselves. Which begs another famous question of Jesus, and that is, who is your neighbor? And we learn from the story of the Good Samaritan that it's not people like us. It's usually people far different from us, often a long way away. And Jesus sums up his message by saying, go and do likewise. Let's do that. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.